So it's my honor to welcome Dr. Erin Lin.
All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. It's really an honor to be able to present my research in front of a new set of faces. As Sarah said, I study the legacy of war, and in today's presentation, we're going to talk about one aspect of war, bombing, and how it impacts the development of villages in Cambodia today. And chances are, if you've heard anything about Cambodia in the context of the Vietnam War, it's rather sobering. The statistics are really similar to what you heard about Laos. So you're probably thinking of the US secret bombing in which we flew over 200,000 sorties in a politically neutral country. Over the course of the Vietnam War, we dropped 2.76 million tons of ordnance, and that's the equivalent of one plane load of bombs dropped every 45 minutes around the clock for a decade. Why did we do this? It started with the secret infiltration of Laos, in which a few CIA officers were going to train and arm Hmong villagers to fight the communist forces, and it eventually enveloped Cambodia. So this escalated into a 9-year war over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those are the supply routes and mobile bases built by the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese in Laos and Cambodia, the parts bordering Vietnam. And it was a war fought primarily with bombs. Now, my research tries to grapple with this question of what is the legacy of war, of bombing on development. And I do so through a combination of ethnographic and quantitative data. I believe the stories really help motivate and decipher the statistics and the econometric analyses that I do. And they're really important for visualizing what life is like at the Vietnam-Cambodia border for smallholder farmers, those that are living on active minefields. And so I'm going to start today's presentation the same way that I start my book, which is talking about the Pan family farmhouse. It sits in the middle of a former battlefield in Ratchathani province, that's the northeastern province of Cambodia that borders Vietnam. And their house is this traditional Khmer house. So it's on stilts, the bedroom and the living room are on the second floor, and they sit upon these 10-foot pylons. And this lifts the house, so it lets air circulate during the hot season, and also lifts the house above flooding waters during wet season. There, I talked to this married couple named Lom and Liang, and Lom takes us to their garden. She points to the soil, and she calls it by its colloquial name, Sokhom, which translates to red soil. The technical Cambodian name is actually Labansiak soil, according to the International Rice Research Institute, and it's formed on the sides of hills as lava flow of ancient volcanoes that kind of created this basaltic rock that's weathered down over millennia. And when you reach down, you touch the grains of you touch the grains of soil, it feels both cushioned and dense, kind of like a Tempur-Pedic mattress. Now there's two really important components to this type of soil. The first is that it's excellent at water retention. So it does not require regular irrigation for commercial production. The second thing is that it's nutrient dense. So horticulturalists estimate that without chemical fertilizer, the soil can produce anywhere from 1,400 to 1,600 kilograms of rice per hectare. Now, Lom and Liang Pan, they're both experienced farmers. So she can identify a wild boar by its tracks, and he has built a walking tractor from spare parts, and the fruit trees and the vegetable garden around their house are absolutely thriving. Lom has raised chickens and dogs and cows in Kasava from Prey Vang province, where she grew up, and Liang has grown up on this land, so they know the land really well. Now, what's puzzling is that despite the years of experience and the hard work that they're clearly putting into their farm, Lom and Liang are more or less failing at small-scale commercial production. So they own about 3 hectares of land, but they have scarcely a half hectare under cultivation when I'm meeting them. And the land itself, when you see it, it's kind of this odd patchwork. So it's largely wild and overgrown, but it's punctuated by these planted and well-maintained fields. But in the cultivated areas, they're only able to produce about a half kilogram, like a pound of rice per year, and even that depends on luck. So one year, a wild boar came in and ate Lom's entire crop, and she lost everything. So it really leads to this question of why are these smart and hardworking farmers in one of the most fertile areas of the country, why are they telling so many losses, just unable to clear their share of agricultural profits? And the more they tell their story, it's really like these two intertwined local events loom large in their family's memory. The first event is the 1970s sighting of a military base within a few kilometers of their house. And the second are these subsequent and repeated US bombings of the area. So just some brief Cambodian history from this local lens. The base was actually built by General Lon Nol. He took over the country from 1971 to 1975. He seized power from King Norodom Sihanouk on the encouragement of the US State Department. And it was during Lon Nol's rule that he sent the KNAF, the Khmer National Armed Forces, a branch of the state military, to Ratnakiri province, with the idea that they would fight Pol Pot's guerrilla army of revolutionaries and their Vietnamese communist counterparts. Now, Lon Nol sited the army's Ratnakiri base on Elephant Hill, Phnom Penh, only a few kilometers away from the Pan family farmhouse. Shortly after Lon Nol took power, the US renewed aerial attacks in Cambodia, and from 1970 to 1973, the US dropped bombs throughout much of the basin where the Pan's farm is located. So when I'm out in the garden with Lom, I hear her husband Liang shout. They're like, "There's a bomb crater!" And he says it's home there, it's like as big as our house. And he like points over there. And so I like look over at the area where he's pointing, and I see like Lom next to me, and she's like sweating bullets. And it's because her land is covered with unexploded bombs. They're hidden inches or even feet below the surface, and it's impossible for newcomers to detect what is lurking inches below without specialized equipment or training. And so you can see in the picture in the middle, that's actually a picture of a cluster bomb that she found while weeding her soil the week before I arrived. And the picture to the right shows a bomb next to a stone. So the stone is the object to the left, and then the cluster bomb is the object to the right. And so you can get a sense of how difficult it is to differentiate bombs from rocks. Bombs are essentially just like these perfect spherical orbs, and that's how you really tell the difference. But if you're not paying attention, it's very easy to glance over them. So I come to this research question as a political scientist. And the way political scientists are trained nowadays in graduate school, it's very heavy in like economic theory and development economics. And one of the things that they really drill into you in the first 2 years is that like neoclassical growth theory in economics, this is by Robert Solow, who won a Nobel Prize. He argues that like economic growth, the way we should think about it both at the micro and the macro level, it's really dependent on 3 factors, like capital, labor, and technology. And a lot of conflict scholars have picked up on this in economics, and they're like, oh look, there's no role for political violence. And so we expect that political violence in the landscape will play very little, if any, role in contemporary economic production. The idea behind this is that war kind of serves as a shock to production, right? So it's a shock in which you get your infrastructure is destroyed, you lose members of your population. But these are periods of depletion, but the formula expects that they should be followed by these periods of transitory growth until a steady state is attained. And so one way that economists have to think about that is that you should have these post-war surges in birth rate that will offset wartime casualties and get you back to that equilibrium that existed before the war started. A lot of people think about this in terms of like industrialized countries and what happens in countries after World War II. So they'll point to cases like, say, Japan and Germany that sustained a lot of damage, but now are global leaders in the global economy. And they'll say, oh, well, it looks like neoclassical economics is right. What I thought, though, is that coming to Cambodia, it seems like there are separate contexts in which it's not going to work as planned. And particularly in agrarian contexts where farming is the most common occupation and local economies are still dependent on rice production, I had a sense that there might be a different story that's being told here, and we in academia should be paying attention to this. And in some ways, I kind of wondered if these economic studies have kind of downplayed war's lasting effects, if they might be missing something. And it could be just because we rely on things like top-line numbers like GDP or export ratios, and those in and of themselves could be misleading because they don't necessarily capture the inequalities within a country or the relevant aspects of poverty that lead to long-term growth traps like limited access to land or slow adaptation of technology. And these powerful tools for quantitative analysis, they might abstract away from this messy, complicated human reality. I thought that the Pan family story really seemed to underscore how by listening closely and becoming sensitive to context, an ethnographic approach can really redefine the range of economic outcomes that we study. And they also provide a very different angle to study bombing, especially considering the current approaches that we have in political science, in international relations, and international security. So just because I'm a political science professor and I love to teach people about the political science canon, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the scholars in IR think about bombing, which tends to be this very US-centric paradigm. And scholars really focus on the merits of military innovation, particularly how they can improve battlefield outcomes or contain American losses and tilt the balance of power in favor of the United States. But these studies are essentially asking a very different question. They're asking why military forces with better technology and capabilities, which normally give countries a huge advantage in fighting, why they can actually lose wars. A lot of these scholars point to the influence of domestic politics. So, for example, Michael Horowitz is at the University of Pennsylvania, and he argues that some militaries are better at adopting new technologies because of their financial capacity and organizational structure. Stephen Biddle is a famous military historian, and he says that military leadership plays an important role here because the leadership's forced employment decisions, so how they choose to organize and deploy their resources, often intervene between theory and practice. And these theories are really great in some ways because they unpack this concept of hard power, showing that it's more than just a budgetary byline or a count of like infantry and aircraft carriers, but it's the product of domestic politics. My beef with this theory, this set of theories though, is that it leaves in the background the connections between superior military technologies and the people on whom they are used. So when we think about superior military technologies, those are like airplanes, surface-to-air missiles, explosive warheads. They're capable of destroying so much from a safe distance. And that's actually the guiding insight of this scholar named Robert Pate at the University of Chicago and his advisor, Thomas Shea, who's a very famous game theorist. And they believe that superior aerial technologies will improve combat in two key ways. So the first helps to think about it from the perspective of the oppositional force. So faced with the prospect of devastating destruction from airstrikes, they believe that targeted societies are more likely to fold. So they should help great powers win wars more decisively. The second thing that they argue is that modern weapons should shield the flesh and blood soldier from the dangers associated with the battlefield. In other words, you might have find a way to fight without putting soldiers at risk. The problem with this approach, though, lies in its distorted perspective. The characterization of the trade-off is about maximizing the odds of the great power winning while minimizing its casualties. But clearly the distribution of casualties is unequal, as are the risks. Aerial weapons have enormous costs for the people who suffer bombings. And the irony is that the attempts to make war less brutal for the American soldier has increased its brutality for those who are targeted. Rosa Brooks is a Georgetown law professor. She actually argues that ground troops make missions more merciful because an infantryman can make moral determinations between life and death with more discrimination than a bomb. So bombs dropped from B-52s flying 50,000 feet in the air. They cannot differentiate between a child and a combatant. And this is honestly a problem that we still have today. So drone operators, for example, have this problem. In 2019, an American F-15 fighter jet dropped 2 warheads on a large crowd of women and children in Syria, thinking that they were Islamic fighters, and over 70 people were killed. So this really leads to this point of, like, if civilians bear the brunt of wartime violence, the question of higher responsibility hangs over the heads of state and military, as well as us, the domestic audiences, the people who hold them accountable. And this is what motivates my research. So in my research, I try to offer a reinterpretation of war's effects through the close examination of an American bombing campaign on its victims. To do this, I spent a year in rural Cambodia observing and farming, but to be honest, I've been going to Cambodia since college, so I've been studying the country about 14 years. And 3 of those months I spent interviewing respondents, mostly farmers, as well as some of the community miners who worked with them. My time there revealed this reversal of fortune that rendered Cambodia's most fertile land unworkable. After the conflict, the unexploded bombs produced and intensified economic inequalities because farmers in heavily bombed areas were and still are unable to take advantage of modern agricultural equipment like tractors, water pumps, as well as new types of commercial crops that require you to till or disturb the soil. My research examines how both the surface conditions at the target site as well as the number of bombs of these sites to discover kind of like how and where impact fuses fail to trigger. And I showed that large numbers of unexploded bombs tend to cluster in the most fertile soil. And this causes farmers in these seemingly ideal areas to produce crops only at the subsistence level. I hope it's okay, but I want to tell you a lot of facts about cluster bombs, partially because I find it just kind of fascinating. So I'm going to walk you through the basics of bomb engineering and why we designed cluster bombs the way that we did. And just for terminology's sake, a cluster bomb actually refers to like one mother casing that releases dozens to hundreds of bomblets, or technically they're also called submunitions. And those are the small anti-personnel bombs that you see in the upper left-hand corner. That's an exterior shot. This is actually a cluster bomb from the Blue 26 series. So this is the second generation of cluster bombs, and it was produced in an R&D lab at Elgin Air Force Base around 1963. They're the second generation. They're actually more compact and more destructive, and they're an improvement from the first generation. So the first generation was called a pineapple bomb colloquially, and that's because the way that they look like kind of like a spray can with veins coming out of it, and they would rain down like pineapples. But the problem with the pineapple bomb as a piece of ordnance is that pilots had to fly very low and level to the ground in order for the dispenser to go off properly. So the R&D lab at Elgin Air Force was thinking like, what is the best way for us to improve upon this particular design of bomb? What they did is that they designed a bomb that is up here, which is also known as the guava bomb locally. And that could be dropped at a 45-degree dive at 5,500 feet. Now, that particular altitude is important because at the time, North Vietnam's largest light anti-aircraft gun was the 57mm S-60. And that could only hit targets that were lower than 5,000 feet. And so that's why it was so important to design this particular type of bomb, and why it became the most commonly used type of cluster bomb during the Vietnam War. So by 1973, 1/3 of the Air Force's ordnance procurement budget was actually dedicated to cluster bombs alone. What I want to do is now also show you a cross-section of the Mk-82 general purpose bomb. Now this is the most used piece of explosive ordnance during the Vietnam War. It's also known as a carpet bomb. This bomb was similar to the cluster bomb in the way that both of them are designed to go off upon impact, but it requires strong impact at the trigger fuse. So in this case, the trigger fuse, there's 2 of them at the nose and the tail of the bomb, and as you can tell, the placement of the strike and the angle matters. Not only that, but it turns out that a bomb's failure rate is also commonly thought to be influenced by the conditions of the surface of the target. So soft ground and dense vegetation can often cushion the fall and prevent the impact fuse from sparking. And there are several types of soft surfaces. So that includes snow, sand, mud, and surface water. They're all found to produce substantial numbers of duds. But it's also in regions where the primary food is produced in paddies, such as rice paddies, where the soft land is the most productive and the most necessary for food security. And so this led me to my general hypothesis when I was studying some of the quantitative data, where bombings on fertile land are expected to then have more problems with unexploded ordnance than bombings on less fertile areas. And this really changes the strategic calculation of the farmer. Because think about how willing you would be to invest in activities that impose an immediate burden on your safety for an uncertain future return. And there's really this different type of trade-off where we didn't talk about yet, which is that in order to self-protect, farmers end up farming less efficiently, avoiding investment in things like heavy machinery, which would leave these really large footprints on the land. So when I give this type of talk to my undergraduate students and to some graduate students, I have a bunch of really nerdy slides that talk you through the empirics of my modeling. And I think the way I want to do this here is that I often am curious, what is the degree to which a lot of these anecdotes, which I think are so compelling and moving, to what degree do they scale up? To what degree do these stories that we hear affect other people besides the ones that we happen to be interviewing? And that's what I think is the reason why I really love doing econometric analysis, because when you're very precise about the data, you can try to understand the degree to which how large this problem is. And to do this, what I did is that I tried to collect data that was as fine-grained as possible at the individual and even at the agricultural plot level. And that would improve upon a lot of previous studies that mostly worked with aggregate economic measures at the province and the district level, which could honestly hide the experience of a lot of disadvantaged farmers. And so I took a lot of pains to go collect the declassified database of US Air Force sorties to actually get the pinpoint coordinates of where every single payload was dropped. And I combined that with agricultural data that I went to Cambodia to talk to their Ministry of Planning and convince them to give me a national representative survey of over 4,000 households where I could actually get the geolocation data of the agricultural plots of those households and learn a lot of outcome variables that I'll talk to in the next slide. So, as you can see, I was able to collect data like the amount of rice each field produced, the amount of rice each household sold to market, the percentage of each field that was used, as well as the absolute amount, as well as the number of agricultural machines that each household had owned, and regress that against the amount of bombs that these households were exposed to and the local level of soil fertility. This was collected in the agricultural census. I have my economic modeling strategy put down here, but the point that I wanted to make is that it's very good to use these statistical models responsibly. So I took pains to make sure I selected models that compared proper units to each other, that is, they're in the same region, they're within similar terrains, and they have similar pre-bombing characteristics, things like population density and the extent to which they grew rice before the US bombing. And I was able to produce these results, and the easiest way to understand them is that each panel is one dependent variable. The x-axis is your soil condition, so whether you're in low fertility land or high fertility land, and the y-axis is the degree of the effect. So the dotted line, the horizontal dotted line, is 0, and if you're touching that dotted line, that means there's no effect. If you're below that dotted line, that means there's a negative effect. And as you can see across these 5 outcomes, in low fertility soil, bombing has no significant effect. In high fertility soil, bombing has a significant negative effect. So where we expect unexploded ordnance, there's a 44% drop in rice sales at the market. There's a 2/3 drop in rice production, controlling for size of the field. And it also impacts household income, which is another part of the article that I don't put up here. And so you actually see that a household on high fertility unbombed soil makes an average of $505 over the course of the year. A similar household experiencing an average amount of bombing makes $301. So that's a 40% reduction in income. I think this is really important to think about the outsized effect that unexploded bombs have relative to land that has had bombs on it, but those bombs have detonated. And I think there's an outsized effect because so much is unknown. That is, you don't know exactly where the bombs are, you don't know the number that's left, they're just so hidden in the ground. So this unknown number of hidden bombs creates what I call a sphere of fear that dampens economic activity throughout the entire settlement. This is what happens when the economist picks up your research and makes much better graphics than you were able to make by yourself. This is also another reason why I'm both very jealous and fearful of millennials, because they're much better at data visualization than I am. But the point that I wanted to make here is that, you see that there's a strong corrosive effect that unexploded ordnance has on agricultural production. And I'm writing a book, or the book is actually done. But the next 2 chapters actually examine the strain on social relationships that occur when you live on these active minefields, and the way that bombs really change casual interactions by amplifying tensions and providing a new repertoire of behaviors to criticize one another. But I'll save that for another talk or encourage you to read the book. But I will want to conclude by talking a little bit about how, though the effects of bombing may vary by context, there's really good reasons to expect that some of these findings will obtain beyond Cambodia. So in the Balkans, there's 150,000 pieces of unexploded ordnance that remain in rural landscapes, such as the forests of Sarajevo. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most heavily mined area is actually the Fertile de Boj region, where demining operations cost an average of €1,000 to remove each munition, and financial cutbacks have delayed removal efforts. Unexploded ordnance continue to wreak havoc on civilian lives, killing and maiming too. The New York Times headline in the middle is from 3 years ago, where Afghan children accidentally detonated unexploded mortar left over from the Soviet invasion, and 5 had died. According to 2018 Afghan government data, the leftover ordnance injure or kill 118 civilians a month. And across the globe, unexploded ordnance from past combat continue to maim about 10 people each day in places as far away as Ukraine, Yemen, Syria, Laos, Vietnam. So unfortunately, my research findings will likely continue to be relevant, despite innovations in things like precision-guided munitions. Other areas are still likely to be cluster bombed. So the US still maintains an arsenal of 2.2 million cluster munitions in the US and 1.5 million cluster munitions abroad. The last confirmed US airstrike involving cluster munitions took place in 2009 in Yemen, but in 2016, survivors of a Saudi aerial attack in Yemen found the latest generation of US manufactured cluster bombs. So given how recently American manufacturers sold cluster munitions abroad, I think unexploded ordnance should then be treated as this enduring political problem, deserving of continued study, attention, and care, and advocacy, rather than just a one-off historical phenomenon. And that's the end of my talk.